Okay, at long last, I'm pretty happy with the progress that I've got on my loader arms. And for the last part, I had to work on the unique side. This right-hand side of the loader arms has a position sensor, and it has a wire that runs along the assembly. And I decided that these were zip ties because I wanted a small challenge on a small part. That I wanted it to be dynamic too, since there were so many. I didn't want them to all be the same thing. The exact same mesh, just rotated. So I wanted them to be a little bit unique. So I decided to model zip ties using curves and mix that with the array modifier so that the length can be dynamic as the curve moves. And so I wanted to go over basically how I created those. So each one just kind of sits in its own little curve and wraps around wherever it needs to go, including this one over here that wraps around the metal bar. So I'm just isolating that on this file. And when I first did this, I think I didn't follow regular rules when it came to using the curve modifier. I kind of just pushed buttons and made things work, and it worked out for me just fine. But I wouldn't recommend that. So Spiky gave me some suggestions, and it's on my loader arms page. If you read through my postings, he does a great time explaining the curve using the curve modifier. And so you take an object basically, and let's ignore the array just for a minute. This object is arrayed and it's got start and end caps, and we'll cover that in a second. But I'm making use of the curve modifier on the deform side. And the curve modifier is technically a deforming modifier. So it'll take your mesh and it deforms it around the curve. And if the curve gets really sharp, it'll actually deform your mesh and pinch it, or it will pull it, which may not always be desired. And I had to do something a little more creative when I made my springs around my hydraulics or my other file. I'll show that here. So if I just used a regular curve modifier for the spring, this bend here actually would pinch these, and they'd get squished, and then they'd get fat on this side. So there's a different way of combining this workflow to make sure you get the same thickness, and you end up using a very basic mesh. This is one set of vertices that just form a 360-degree circle, but then I ripped it and offset it linearly, and then I arrayed that, and then with the array I joined that to a curve. And since it was just vertices, they don't have any thickness. And then after the curve modifier, I added a skin. So I'm getting a little bit off topic, but I wanted to cover that because the curve modifier does deform mesh, but it won't deform something that doesn't have thickness. So then you can add something like the skin modifier, which now makes a square cross section along the entire vertex path, and then you can subdivide that. So if I turn the subdivision on, yeah, you get nice little pretty circles, and they don't deform at all, which is really nice. So thought that was pretty cool, and I wanted to at least share that. I got that from a different posting, but we want to talk about the zip tie more. And so how did I make this zip tie? Well, I'm making use of the curve modifier, and right now I'm meshing this zip tie body to just a straight Bez curve. But what we want at the end of the day is we want a zip tie that obviously is dynamic, and as I move my curve around, it grows and shrinks. And if I go to the side view, or I just constrain my movement so I'm not moving in the x-axis, so G, Shift X, notice how I'm not necessarily deforming as much. I do along the tight bends, but notice how the head just adds extra little zip edges. So I can make these zip ties varying amounts of lengths. So I can grow this. And you can see the head kind of jerking left and right. And it's adding extra zips along that. And I'll show how I got that effect to work. We'll turn this off just for a second because the straight one's easier to explain. So at the end of the day, everything. Turn this guy off and turn this guy off. I'll turn off the array modifier, and all it really is this piece. And we'll turn off the curve as well. If I go into edit mode, I just got one piece with a single tooth for the zip tie to be locked in place, and had to make sure that the origin was in the center and it started with the origin of the curve. That way it starts following the path of the curve. I originally had this offset up and the origin was sitting along the bottom. And when I added the curve modifier, it started almost like it was the end of the curve. So this was a tip from Spiky. Make sure that your origin of both your object and the curve match the same location to help it deform along the curve. Once I got that done, when I turned on the array, there's an option here to give start and end caps. So what I did is I just copied this and then I duplicated it to start both of my caps. And for my end cap, go back to the main. This is my main body. I wanted the end cap to be the head, and I wanted the start cap to be the tail. And I added a couple extra teeth for the tail, just because when it gets close to the curve, you don't end up having any more teeth to work with. So if you add just a few extras, it always has a few teeth at the end, and I'll show you that when I get the curve back in place. But they're both sharing. And this is how you get start and end caps to work really well. Is you make sure that the vertices that match at the top side and at the bottom side are the exact same location as the vertices at the top and bottom of the array piece. And they do, if you end up moving these in edit mode anywhere else away from the origin that sets them up properly. And I don't fully understand the origin, to be honest. I had to set it at the center, just like I set this at the center for both of these. So the origin is set at the center of the copy that I made. And when I did that, I can hide these pieces now. I could turn the array on, and if I just arrayed without the end caps, it's just the tooth being arrayed. And I used a fit curve with the Bezier curve as the length. So however long I want to make that Bezier curve, like if I move this up in Z, that thing's going to grow or shrink. If I scale it down, makes it nice and dynamic. But it's not very interesting without those start and end caps. So go turn those back on. Now another important thing with this curve is, and I don't fully understand this, but when you're deforming the curve, you're also deforming the base mesh about its local axes as well. And so I wanted the vector arrows. I know people like to turn these off, but for me it really helped getting my vector arrows lined up with how I wanted my object to be wrapping around the curve. And for whatever reason, the object actually spins 180 when I pick the deformation axis for the curve. And I want it to follow the curve along the z-axis. So if I picked X, I gotta turn it on. This is the X-axis on the local curve, and I can show that when I turn on texturing. And we'll turn off the array just to show one piece. So here's the object, and it's now got the positive X face. When I clicked on the deformation axis, it aligns it with the curve. So if I move the object G and X, the object, as I go increasing in x on a positive direction, the object moves positive with the curve. And negative, it just ends with the vector arrow direction of the last point of the curve. And same thing when I do y. It's easy to kind of show if I turn this off. Like I've got my positive y going with the local positive y direction, the negative y, negative x, and positive x, following this structure here. And when I turn the curve on, as I pick these, it orients the local axis to follow the curve. And as I move along, gy, as we move along the y-axis, it'll move up and down with the curve just like it did with the x. And when I do it with the, let me turn this off. So I've got it pointing with the tooth pointing this way, and when I turn z on, it flips 180. And I don't fully understand that, but it does what I want it to do. So if it's not the right direction, then I just rotate my mesh 180 in edit mode. So RZ 180. I want to be rotating about the 3D cursor, sorry. So everything else kind of gets screwed up with my texture paint when I do that. But I would get the ribs pointing the right direction if I had it backwards. Now I had it the way I wanted it. So it's pointing the other direction. So that's just a small little tidbit tip. Now the interesting thing is, so I've got my Z direction. So as I move with Z, this thing will move up with the curve, which is what I want. So as I deform this curve now, and I move this object in Z, like it just follows that curve around. That's not very exciting when it's one piece, but when you turn the array on, the entire array follows around. And that's what gives it the magic for the zip tie. Now I like to keep everything in the same plane when I'm moving the zip ties around. And that may not be entirely realistic, but then I don't have to worry about this whole scrunching and bending, because I can't use a skin modifier with this style of mesh. At least I don't know how. So I keep everything in the same plane, and I think that works pretty well. I think I can get away with a little bit of bending and twisting, but I don't want something like this. So I'm gonna turn off this straight example, and we'll actually have the curved example on now. And I don't want the head and tail; they can be hidden. Oh, a couple of small notes. So with the head and the tail, I originally gave them subdivision surface modifiers, but you don't need that for the individual pieces as long as the main body that's using the array modifier, when you give that the subdivision surface, it does it for everything. And that's really important. I ended up subdividing my pieces twice, I think, beforehand, and then I don't think I had a very good transition at where the head and the tail were because one piece was more subdivided than the other. And it's hard to tell until you get really close, but you don't need that for the pieces when they're not being used on anything else. You just do it to the main body piece. So hopefully that helps. But now I can just grab the curve and I can go in the side view and I can move this around, move these, scale them out. I'll turn off the head and the tail. And one of the cool things I really like about this is as I'm moving these, if I wanted to scale that, because I set the thickness up pretty well for the main lock piece here, it moves into the tooth pretty well. And I need to move my assembly up just a little bit so that I can show it being on the teeth. So I'll just move these up with Z. But you can see it kind of looking like it's clicking against the teeth. Because the array of my height, it almost matches the tooth width, which gives it a really good zip tie effect almost. It goes a little bit past and a little bit above, but it makes it easy for me to be able to align things up when I want to get things really close. And that's pretty much all I wanted to share. Now, I don't know how many vertices small pieces like this should really have. And just to give you reference how small this is, we'll turn on the default cube again. And that's how small that is. So, should that really have that many faces? I don't know. I guess Kent can tell us if that's okay. I mean, 9,000 faces, but it looks really nice when you get up close. So, hopefully that's fun though. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Kent wanted me to show a video of basically how I made this and the things that I learned. I can't say I know everything about the curve modifier, but I learned a lot doing this exercise. So, thanks guys, and we'll see you in the live stream.